I had just turned 28 when I was assigned to the backcountry ranger station deep in the Cascades, around 100 miles from the nearest town. The year was 1998, and I was still fairly new to the Park Service, having spent most of my previous summers working at visitor centers and patrolling the more trafficked trails. This station, a small, weathered cabin tucked into a clearing near a bend of the Skyrock River, was something else entirely. It was isolated, surrounded by dense evergreens that blocked out most of the sky, and the kind of place where the only company you had came in the form of birds, deer, or the occasional wandering elk. The cabin itself was a single story, made of dark-stained timber with a small porch that sagged slightly on one side. Inside, it smelled faintly of pine and old wood smoke. There was a wood-burning stove in the corner, a tiny kitchenette, and a loft bed above a storage area. Everything was utilitarian with very few personal touches, and the station had no phone line and only a shortwave radio for emergencies. I'd been told the nearest ranger outpost was more than 20 miles away through rough, unmaintained trails. I arrived in late October, when the days were getting short and the nights bitterly cold. The forest around the cabin was a mixture of shadows and whispers. The wind moving through the trees sounded almost alive. I spent the first few days stocking firewood, checking the perimeter, and making sure all the supplies were in order. The river nearby ran fast and dark, its surface occasionally disturbed by fish jumping or debris floating by. The forest seemed quiet at first, but there was a tension in the air I couldn't quite explain. The first night, I stayed in the loft bed, the only heat coming from the stove I'd managed to light. The wind outside was strong, rattling the thin window panes, and I remember thinking about how easy it would be for someone, or something, to approach the cabin unnoticed. I chalked it up to nerves, though. Out here, you learned quickly that being on edge was part of the job. Around the third day, I noticed odd things while patrolling the perimeter. Small footprints in the mud near the edge of the clearing, human-sized, but I didn't recognize the tread pattern. Sometimes I'd see broken branches or moved rocks that I was sure I hadn't disturbed. At first, I assumed it was hikers or hunters ignoring the park boundaries. But the further I walked into the forest, the more I felt watched. The trees seemed to close in, and the occasional snap of a twig behind me made my heart race. Though when I turned, there was nothing there. By the fourth night, the wind had picked up, and the rain came in hard, lashing against the cabin and turning the clearing into a muddy mess. I had just settled in with a book, the stove crackling at my feet, when I heard it, a steady scraping at the door. At first, I froze, hoping it was just the wind, but the rhythm didn't match anything natural. Someone or something was deliberately testing the door. I grabbed my flashlight and peered through the small window beside it. The beam cut through the rain and darkness, landing on nothing but mud and shadow. I spent that night sitting close to the stove, keeping the door locked, listening to the rain hammering down and every sound outside. The next morning, I found long scratches along the door frame, deep enough to catch my fingernail. That wasn't wind. That wasn't a deer. I knew that much. Over the next few days, the disturbances escalated. I started finding items outside that I hadn't left there. An old tin can, a piece of rope, footprints that weren't mine. I reinforced the windows and door as best I could with spare planks, and I kept the stove roaring day and night to provide some comfort. Every patrol into the forest was tense. Every shadow seemed to move, and every sound made me spin around, heart hammering, convinced someone was following me. One night, the wind died down, and a thick fog rolled in from the river. Visibility dropped to a few feet, and the forest felt even heavier, more oppressive. That night, I had just finished my dinner, a tin of beans heated on the stove, when I noticed something on the porch through the fog. At first, I thought it was a log or a branch, but as my eyes adjusted, I realized it was a figure, standing completely still, just watching. My first instinct was to call out, but I forced myself to stay silent. The figure didn't move, didn't make a sound, and then, almost imperceptibly, it turned and slipped into the fog. I checked the area with my flashlight. Nothing. No footprints. Nothing disturbed. After that night, I decided I couldn't stay inside all the time. I set out a few makeshift traps for small game just in case and made a point of patrolling at odd hours. I kept a loaded rifle within reach and carried a flare gun when I went farther from the cabin. Still, the feeling of being watched never left. The breaking point came one evening when I was cutting firewood about 50 feet from the cabin. The rain had stopped, and the air smelled damp and earthy. I had stacked a pile of logs and turned to return to the cabin when I noticed the mud near the tree line had fresh footprints. Larger than mine, heavy, deliberate, heading straight toward the cabin. My heart jumped. I dropped the axe and sprinted back, sliding in the mud, adrenaline burning through every muscle. Inside, I secured the door and windows again, checking every lock. The scratches on the door had multiplied overnight, deeper this time, with chunks of wood splintered and missing. Whoever or whatever had been outside had gotten closer. I kept the lights low, stove roaring, and tried to convince myself it was just a lost hiker or someone drunk. But instinct told me otherwise. That night, I made a plan. I couldn't stay trapped forever, and I couldn't risk the cabin being compromised. At first light, I would hike to the nearest ranger station and radio for help. I spent the rest of the night watching the forest, the beam of my flashlight slicing through the darkness, waiting for any sign of movement. Dawn came gray and heavy with mist. I packed a small bag with essentials, checked the rifle, and stepped outside. The footprints from the night before were still visible, leading straight into the tree line. I followed a well-worn animal trail for a few miles, every step tense, every rustle in the underbrush making me jump. Hours later, exhausted, muddy, and soaked, I reached the ranger station. I radioed in my report. A team was dispatched immediately, and they retraced my steps back to the cabin. When they arrived, they found the door heavily damaged, the windows reinforced, but nothing else. No signs of who or what had been outside, no tracks leading away. Only the mud and the scratches. The team stayed for a few days patrolling the area, and I returned with them to the main ranger outpost. I was reassigned after that, given more standard patrol duties, and I never went back to that cabin. The isolation, the sense of being watched, the scratches, the silent figure in the fog, it stayed with me for years. It wasn't supernatural. It wasn't a ghost. It was someone or something human-sized, careful, and relentless, prowling the forest, testing the limits of an empty cabin and the person inside. The experience taught me the real danger of isolation, of being in the wilderness where the line between safety and exposure is razor thin, and how quickly a peaceful place can become a trap. I kept thinking about that cabin for months afterward, and every time I hiked alone in the mountains, my eyes darted to shadows, my heart rate spiked at the sound of distant footsteps, and I remembered the cold clarity of that night, the wind, the rain, the fog, and the feeling that someone had been waiting just outside, watching, patient, silent, and impossibly close. Years later, when I returned to the Cascades on a vacation, I avoided that clearing entirely. The cabin was still there, though weathered even more, doors hanging slightly off their hinges. Nothing had been done to repair it, and the forest had begun reclaiming the clearing. I stood across the river and stared at it, remembering everything, and I felt a strange relief. I survived. I walked away, and I knew that sometimes the scariest encounters aren't about monsters or myths. They're about being utterly alone, exposed, and realizing how vulnerable you truly are. It was the summer of 2014 when I decided to take a solo trip into the mountains of northern Idaho. I was 28, restless, and desperate to escape the crowded streets and noise of Boise. The idea of finding an old cabin, somewhere far off the beaten path, had been floating in my mind for months. I wanted isolation, silence, the kind of emptiness that forces you to confront your own thoughts. I never expected what I found would grip me with a fear I hadn't known existed. A fear that wasn't the stuff of stories, but of pure, tangible reality. The road was a rough one, barely more than a dirt track winding through thick pines. My Jeep groaned over the ruts and rocks, and the air was dry and heavy with the scent of pine needles. I had packed light, a small backpack with water, canned food, a flashlight, and a first aid kit. GPS signal vanished as soon as I left the main road, leaving me with only a map I had printed at home and a vague memory of coordinates scribbled on a crumpled piece of paper. I remember feeling a thrill at being this disconnected, the kind of thrill that feels dangerously close to recklessness. After 2 hours of bumping along the track, I saw it, nestled in a small clearing, surrounded by trees that had grown too close over decades, was a cabin. It was old, older than I expected. The roof sagged in the middle, and some shingles were missing, leaving dark holes where rain and snow had seeped through over the years. The wooden walls were weathered, gray, and cracked, with moss climbing up in patches. The porch sagged dangerously, but I could see enough space inside through the gaps in the walls to convince myself it might still be safe to explore. As I stepped out of the Jeep, the air around me changed. It was quieter than it should have been. The wind whispered through the trees, but there were no birds, no insects, no rustle of small animals. The silence pressed against me like a weight. My boots crunched against the dry leaves on the ground, and the cabin's shadow stretched long across the clearing, distorted by the uneven terrain. I approached cautiously, testing the porch with a careful step. The wood groaned but held, and I made it inside. The smell hit me immediately. Damp wood, mold, rot, and something metallic, faint but undeniable. Sunlight filtered in through gaps in the roof, casting jagged stripes across the floor. Broken furniture lay scattered. A chair on its side, a table with one leg missing, and a mattress that had long ago lost its stuffing. On the walls, I could see faint scratches and dark streaks, but I couldn't tell whether they were from animals, water, or something else. I spent a few minutes surveying the place, trying to shake off the unease curling in my stomach. Then I noticed something odd. There were footprints, faded, partially covered in dust, but human footprints, leading from the back of the cabin to the front door. They were small, as if someone had come and gone quietly, and I couldn't see any pattern beyond that. The idea that someone might be living here, or had been recently, made my pulse quicken. I rationalized it. People sometimes squatted in abandoned buildings, I told myself. Nothing more. I decided to explore the surrounding area, hoping to find a safe place to set up my small camp for the night. Behind the cabin, the forest thickened. The ground was littered with fallen branches, the trunks of trees so close together it was almost impossible to walk without brushing against the rough bark. I noticed small traps, wire snares, and makeshift pits covered with leaves, likely set for rabbits or squirrels. Whoever had been here last had been careful, strategic even, leaving signs of survival for anyone paying attention. The realization made my skin crawl. As afternoon bled into evening, shadows lengthening in the forest, I went back to the cabin to set up my sleeping area. I cleared a corner of the floor, placing a tarp down and arranging my backpack as a pillow. Outside, the wind picked up, rattling loose boards and whistling through the broken windows. I told myself it was just the wind. That was all it could be. Night fell faster than I expected, and with it came the sounds. Soft at first, a twig snapping in the distance, leaves rustling as if brushed by something unseen. Then heavier, deliberate sounds. Footsteps circling the cabin, not fast, but steady, confident. My heart thumped in my chest, each beat loud in my ears. I tried to convince myself it was a deer or a bear, but the rhythm, the weight was wrong. It was too purposeful, too measured. I grabbed my flashlight and shone it toward the windows, sweeping across the clearing. The beam caught on something at the edge of the forest. A figure, or something standing like a figure, watched me. I froze. It didn't move. It didn't run. It simply waited. And in that moment, I realized how alone I truly was. The forest seemed to close in around the cabin. Every shadow was sharper, every tree a possible hiding place. Hours passed. I stayed awake, flashlight in hand, watching the clearing. The figure didn't leave, didn't move, didn't blink. At one point, I caught the glint of metal in its hand, a rifle. Panic surged, and I knew I couldn't stay inside the cabin forever. I had to leave. At first light, I packed as quietly as I could, slipping out through a side door I had propped open earlier. The figure was still there on the far side of the clearing, watching. I kept my head down, ran toward my Jeep, stumbling over roots and rocks, heart hammering. When I finally reached the vehicle and slammed the door shut, the figure didn't chase me. It didn't move. It simply stood there, as if marking a boundary, a line I was never meant to cross. The drive back down the dirt track was agonizingly slow. Every rustle in the trees, every shadow on the road made me flinch. But I didn't look back. I didn't stop until I hit the paved road that led back to civilization. Once I was back in Boise, safe, surrounded by people, the fear didn't leave immediately. Even days later, I could feel the weight of that silent watcher, the knowledge that someone or something had been there long before me and would remain long after. I never went back to that cabin. I marked the location vaguely in my mind, but I never recorded the coordinates, never told anyone precisely where it was. Part of me knew that some places are meant to remain abandoned, and some encounters are meant to be remembered quietly, as a warning. The fear I felt wasn't the dramatic kind told in stories around campfires. It was real, grounding, and persistent. It was a reminder that some isolation is dangerous, and some curiosity is better left unsatisfied. Months later, I learned from local news that a drifter had been living in the woods in that area, known for trapping and hunting illegally. He had been spotted by hikers, but no one had dared approach. The description matched exactly what I had seen from the cabin. Knowing that, I felt a grim sense of closure. I had survived because I had been careful, because I had left before making a sound. The cabin wasn't haunted, and there was no supernatural threat. There was just the reality of another human being, solitary, unpredictable, and entirely capable of violence. I still think about that cabin sometimes, not with fear exactly, but with a cautious respect. The trees, the silence, the weight of being watched. It stays with you. It's a lesson in understanding that some places carry histories, and some encounters leave marks that don't fade. I've returned to the mountains since, but I always stick to the main trails now. I never again sought isolation that deep. I've learned that the wilderness is honest. It doesn't lie, but it demands vigilance, awareness, and a healthy respect for the unknown that is not supernatural, but entirely real. I still remember the cold weight of that night in the north of England, the kind of cold that feels older than the land itself. It was late autumn of 2018, the trees already stripped bare, the sky a pale steel color that made the daylight feel thin. I had rented a small timber cabin on the edge of a forest outside a quiet village called Grenton Moor. I told myself I wanted a break from my work in Leeds, a few days of silence, a place where I didn't have to hear traffic or deal with any city noise. The listing had made the cabin seem charming, with a small porch, a creek nearby, and enough walking trails to fill a week, but it hadn't mentioned how isolated it really was. The nearest house was a 20-minute walk down a narrow track that twisted through the trees. The cabin itself looked older than the photos had shown. The wood was dark and worn, the nails rusted, the front door slightly crooked in its frame. When I first stepped inside, it smelled of cold air and damp timber, but I didn't mind it. It reminded me of old holiday cottages I'd stayed in as a kid. There were 2 small rooms, a main space with a table, a stove, and a battered sofa, and a little bedroom in the back with a single bed that looked like it belonged in a youth hostel. Everything felt simple and quiet. On my second day there, the weather turned worse. A thick fog rolled in from the hills during the afternoon and settled between the trees like a heavy blanket. The forest became a maze of pale shapes, thin branches, and shifting shadows. I went on a short walk that evening, following a narrow footpath that circled around the cabin and down to the creek. The water was slow and dark, almost still. The moss-covered stones beside it felt slick under my boots. As I walked back, I noticed something that made me stop. On the far side of the creek, deeper into the forest, I saw a shape. It looked like a man standing among the trees. He was tall enough to stand out clearly even through the fog, and his clothes looked dark, almost blending with the tree trunks. He didn't move. He just stood there, facing in my direction. I couldn't see his face, only the outline of his figure. At first I thought it might be a walker or a hunter or someone from the village, but something about his stillness didn't feel right. Most people shift their weight or scratch their arm or check their phone when they're standing around. This man didn't do anything. It felt like he'd been there far longer than I had realized, as if he'd been watching me from the moment I arrived by the water. I told myself not to make assumptions. Fog can make distances strange. Maybe he wasn't actually staring at me. Maybe he was just looking at the creek. I turned away and walked back to the cabin, telling myself it was nothing. Still, I kept glancing behind me until I reached the door. That night, I lay in the narrow bed with the thin blanket pulled up to my chin, listening to the sounds outside. The cabin walls were thin, and the forest felt like it pressed right against them. I could hear the wind dragging its way between branches, the soft thud of something dropping from a tree, and every so often a sound that reminded me of footsteps on wet leaves. The cabin felt smaller in the dark, as if the world beyond it had grown heavier. The next morning, I tried to return to a normal mindset. I made tea, ate from a tin of soup, and planned a longer walk. The fog had lifted but left behind a damp chill that made the ground soft under my shoes. I followed the path deeper into the woods than I had the day before. The forest was quiet, but not in a peaceful way. It felt like everything was holding its breath. After about an hour of walking, I found something strange half hidden under a cluster of fallen branches. A small wooden structure. Not a full cabin, more like a makeshift shelter or an old hunting hide. The wood was gray and swollen from the weather, the roof partly caved in, and the doorway wide open. For some reason, I felt drawn to it. I stepped closer, brushing aside the branches, and saw footprints in the mud leading into it. They were fresh. The shape of them suggested boots, larger than mine. Inside, the shelter was empty except for an old metal kettle, a torn sleeping bag, and a pile of dry leaves in the corner. The smell inside was odd, like stale sweat mixed with damp clothes. It looked like someone had been staying there, but not in a planned way. More like someone who drifted through the woods and slept wherever they could. That's when a sound behind me made my skin tighten. It was a single crack, like a branch snapping under someone's weight. I turned around fast, but the forest was silent again. No movement, no figure, no sign of anyone. But I felt watched, deeply watched, the way you feel when you walk into a room and someone is staring at your back. I left the shelter and headed straight back to the cabin. My walk was meant to clear my mind, but instead every step made me more aware of the trees around me, how they closed in tight and how wrong the silence felt. When I reached the cabin, something was different. The front door, which I was sure I had closed tightly, was slightly open. Not wide open, just a few inches. Enough to show darkness inside. My chest tightened. The air around the cabin felt colder than before. I stepped to the side of the door, gripping the handle, and pushed it open slowly. The inside looked untouched. The table was as I left it, the stove cold, the sofa pushed against the wall. But the feeling of the room had changed. It felt like someone had been inside while I was gone. There was a faint smell of damp clothes, the same smell I'd noticed in the shelter. I checked the bedroom last. The bed looked normal except for one thing. The blanket had been moved. Not thrown or messed up, just shifted in a way that suggested someone had sat on it. The weight had pressed the fabric down slightly. I hadn't sat there since morning. The air grew tighter around me. Every room in the cabin felt wrong, like invisible fingerprints clung to the surfaces. I didn't know what to do, so I locked the door, even though the lock was loose and old. I stayed awake most of that night, sitting on the sofa with my back against the wall, listening. At one point, around midnight, I heard slow footsteps outside. They weren't animal footsteps. They were heavy, spaced like a person walking. They circled the cabin once, then again. I didn't move. I didn't breathe properly. The footsteps stopped below the bedroom window. I imagined someone standing there, staring in through the glass. But I forced myself not to look. I didn't want to know. The footsteps faded after a long time, at least an hour, maybe more. When the sun finally rose, weak and pale, I packed everything in minutes. I didn't make food, didn't drink water, didn't even fold the blanket. I walked out the door, ready to head back to the village, but something on the porch stopped me cold. On the wooden step, pressed into the damp surface, was a footprint. A large boot print, fresh, directly facing the door. Too close. It meant he had stood right there, only a thin wooden door between him and me. I walked fast down the track, not stopping for anything, not looking back. The forest felt alive with the memory of the night. Every rustle made me flinch. Every shape between the trees made my stomach twist. When I finally reached the village road, I felt air fill my lungs again. The weight lifted. Houses came into view. Cars passed now and then. Normal life returned around me, steady and solid. I never went back to the cabin. I never reported anything to the police because I had no face, no name, no proof. All I had was a footprint and the memory of being watched. But the ending is simple and clear. I left, and I survived, because I trusted the fear in my body before it was too late. And to this day, when I think about the man in the forest, I realize something that still unsettles me more than anything else. He didn't just find that cabin by accident. He had been there long before me, and he had probably watched everyone who ever stayed there. I had been working alone in the northern part of Montana in the fall of 2019, doing a land survey job for a small company that needed updated measurements for a set of old forest access roads. The place was wide, cold, and empty. The kind of land where miles went by without any houses, only endless walls of pine trees and hard dirt roads that shook the bones in my ribs every time my truck rolled over them. I was 36 then, old enough to know better than to work alone this deep into the woods, but I had taken the job because the pay was good and the schedule was short. My plan was to finish the work in 3 days and head back to my apartment in Helena. On the second day, around mid-afternoon, the weather changed faster than I expected. The sky went from bright to heavy and metallic, like someone pulled a thick sheet of steel across it. I felt a pressure drop, the kind that makes your ears tighten. The wind picked up and carried cold air that cut right through my jacket. I checked my maps and saw that I had 2 more miles left to reach the next survey point. I didn't want to lose daylight, so I pushed forward through the wet ground, carrying my gear, marking coordinates, taking measurements, and moving deeper into the trees. By the time I finished the last measurement, the wind had turned into a steady roar, pushing against the branches so hard that dead needles rained down across the ground. I started heading back toward the truck, but the forest didn't look like it had earlier. Shadows were darker, and the air felt thick. When I reached the area where I thought I had parked, the truck wasn't there. I walked around the clearing twice, then 3 times, feeling my stomach tighten. I checked my GPS, and it kept shifting like it couldn't lock onto anything. For a moment, I wondered if I had walked past it or if the wind was messing with my sense of direction. I walked another 100 yards, then another, and I still didn't find the truck. My legs were tired, and the wind was so loud that it felt like it was crawling into my ears. I knew the rule: never wander far when you're unsure of your bearings. I decided to go uphill so I could look for a clearing, hoping the height would help me spot the road. The climb was slow and shaky, and my boots slipped on loose dirt. When I finally reached the top, I didn't see the road or the truck. Instead, on the opposite side, partly hidden by trees, I saw a small cabin. It looked like it hadn't been used in decades. Half the roof sagged downward, and many of the boards were gray and warped. But there was a chimney, and the shape of the structure meant it could at least block wind. With the temperature dropping and the sky looking ready to dump rain or early snow, I decided I'd check it out and wait inside until the storm passed. As I got closer, the cabin looked rougher than it had from a distance. The door hung unevenly, and there were cracks between the wall planks where light pushed through. The smell of old wood, dust, and wet pine filled the air. When I stepped inside, the floor creaked loudly under my weight, and I felt the boards shift in one spot like they were barely holding together. The interior was one open room with a rusted wood stove, a broken chair, and an old metal bed frame leaning against the far wall. The place looked abandoned, but not destroyed, which meant I could stay there without the roof falling on me. The wind outside grew stronger until it sounded like something alive, something crawling along the walls. I set my backpack near the center of the room and sat on the floor so I wouldn't risk the chair collapsing under me. I ate a protein bar and drank water, trying to calm my thoughts. The plan was simple: wait out the weather, then try to retrace my steps in the morning. But as the light faded, I realized something was off. The cabin didn't feel as empty as it looked. I noticed it first when I stood up to stretch my legs. My boot brushed dirt on the floor, and I saw long, thin scratches in the wood. They weren't the kind left by animals. They were straight, sharp, and too precise, like someone had dragged the tip of a tool or knife across the floor repeatedly. Near the wall by the bed frame, I saw another set of scratches, this time clustered together in short, tight groups. They looked like marks made by someone who was pacing or standing in the same spot for a long time. I tried to tell myself they were old marks from someone sharpening tools or dragging equipment, but they didn't feel old. They looked too clean, too fresh, like the wood had been shaved not that long ago. The wind screamed outside, and the door rattled in its frame. The whole cabin shook. I pulled my knees closer to my chest, trying to ignore the uneasy feeling spreading through me. The air felt colder inside than it had outside, a strange kind of cold that clung to the skin. As the minutes crawled by, a deep thud echoed from under the floor. It wasn't the wind. It wasn't the house settling. It was too heavy, too deliberate. The floor moved slightly beneath me, just a small tremble, but enough to make the hair on my arms stand. I held completely still and listened. Another thud followed, softer this time, like something shifting its weight under the cabin. I moved my flashlight beam across the floor and noticed something I had missed earlier. A small square cutout near the back corner, covered with a loose board. A crawl space or old storage pit. The board looked like it had been moved many times, edges worn smooth where fingers had gripped it. I stared at it for a long time, hoping I was imagining what I had heard. Then the board lifted a fraction of an inch. I didn't breathe. I didn't move. I watched as it shifted again, just enough to reveal a thin sliver of blackness underneath. Something was down there, something alive. My body reacted before my mind did. I grabbed my backpack, slung it over my shoulder, and moved toward the door as quietly as I could. The wind outside roared, but inside the cabin, everything felt silent except for the slight scrape of the board being pushed up more and more. I stepped out into the cold air, and the wind nearly knocked me sideways, but I kept moving. I didn't look back. I didn't want to see what was climbing out of that space. I pushed through the trees, heading downhill in a straight line, even though the terrain was uneven and hard to navigate in the dark. Branches slapped against my face, and the ground slipped under my boots, but I kept going. After nearly an hour of stumbling through the forest, I finally found the dirt road by accident, when my foot hit the packed soil and I almost fell forward. I followed the road by muscle memory, using the reflective strips on my gear to catch the faint light of my flashlight. My entire body felt tense, like something was still watching me from the trees, but I didn't hear anything except the wind. I walked for what felt like forever until I saw a dark shape ahead. My truck. It had rolled slightly into a ditch, probably pushed by the wind or left on uneven ground. The sight of it felt like the first breath of air after being underwater too long. I climbed inside, locked the doors, and waited for my heartbeat to slow down before starting the engine. I drove all the way back to town without stopping, even though the road was rough and the wind kept pushing the truck sideways. When I finally reached my apartment, I sat in the parked truck for a long time, staring straight ahead, trying to process everything. The next day, I told the company I wouldn't be finishing the job. I didn't explain why. I didn't mention the cabin or the scratches or the sounds from beneath the floor. I knew how it would sound, like I was tired or stressed or imagining things, but I knew what I heard, and I knew that whoever had made those marks and moved that board was real. For weeks afterward, I kept thinking about the crawl space. I kept seeing that board lifting, just a few inches, slow and careful, like someone testing to see if it was safe to come out. Whoever lived down there wasn't lost, and they weren't trying to be found. They had been staying in that cabin long enough to carve marks into the floors and walls, long enough to learn how to move quietly, long enough to know when someone else stepped inside their space. I never went back to that stretch of forest. I never even looked at a map of it again. I still think about what would have happened if I had stayed in the cabin even 10 minutes longer. The ending in my mind is always the same, and it is always clear. Walking out when I did was the only thing that kept me from finding out who or what was living under those floorboards. And some endings are better left unknown. I first went to the cabin the summer of 2009. I was 34, tired of city life, and looking for something quieter, something simple. I found it tucked into a clearing at the edge of a sprawling old farm in western Pennsylvania. The cabin wasn't fancy, just a small, weathered wooden structure with faded red paint peeling off its boards. The surrounding farm had long been abandoned. The fields were overgrown with weeds, and the barn's roof sagged under years of neglect. Still, there was something about it that called to me. I arrived late in the afternoon, hauling my gear in my old pickup. The sun was low, casting long shadows over the fields. The air smelled sharp, earthy, a mixture of dried grass and damp soil. I parked near the cabin, stepping out to feel the crunch of dead leaves under my boots. My dog, Max, a lean, black and tan shepherd mix, barked once and darted into the weeds, sniffing everything. I liked that he was curious. It made me feel safer somehow. The cabin's door creaked when I opened it. Dust motes floated in the streams of light from the windows. Inside, the place smelled musty, like old wood and mold. I had brought a small camping stove, canned food, and a lantern. The cabin had an old wood stove in the corner, which looked functional but would need careful tending. I set up my things quickly, eager to get settled before darkness fully fell. Outside, the wind picked up, rustling the tall grass and bending the weeds in strange, twisting patterns. That first night, the noises started almost immediately. At first, it was small things. A branch scraping against the side of the cabin, the distant thump of something heavy in the barn, Max growling quietly from the corner. But as the hours stretched on, the noises grew sharper, closer, like someone or something was moving through the farm. I kept telling myself it was the wind or a raccoon or maybe a stray dog. I tried to sleep, but every small sound made me tense. Around 2 in the morning, I woke to Max barking furiously. I grabbed the lantern and crept to the window. The yard was bathed in pale moonlight, the tall weeds casting shadows that looked like moving figures. First, I saw nothing. Then, a movement near the edge of the barn caught my eye, a shadow slipping between the boards. My heart jumped. I could see it wasn't a person, at least not a normal one. The shape was hunched, deliberate. My first thought was a deer, but the way it moved didn't match any animal I'd seen before. I sat in the cabin, trying to calm down. I remembered the small hunting rifle I'd brought. I loaded it, just in case, and settled into a corner with Max at my feet. Hours passed slowly, the noises outside never stopping completely. Sometimes it sounded like footsteps crunching through the weeds, other times like a low growl. By the time the first light of dawn filtered through the windows, I was exhausted, but I had survived the night. The next day, I decided to explore. I walked carefully through the fields, Max at my side. The barn was old, the wood rotting. I noticed footprints, large, deep impressions in the soft dirt, heading from the tree lean to the cabin. They didn't look like any animal I knew. The prints were too big for a dog or a deer, and they had a strange, uneven spacing like the person or creature was limping or moving awkwardly. My stomach tightened. Whoever or whatever had made them was close. I spent the next few days keeping watch. I didn't leave the cabin after dark. I made sure to block the windows with whatever boards I could find, and I stayed alert. Max was restless too. He barked at every rustle in the weeds and sometimes stared into the distance, growling low in his throat. I couldn't shake the feeling that something was studying me, waiting for a mistake. On the 4th night, it escalated. Around midnight, I heard heavy breathing outside, slow and deliberate. It wasn't far from the cabin. I held the rifle tightly, my knuckles white. Max growled and crouched low. Then suddenly, there was a loud crash against the side of the cabin, like someone had thrown a heavy log or maybe tried to break in. I fired a warning shot into the air. The sound echoed across the fields. The crashing stopped. Silence fell, thick and heavy, broken only by Max's soft panting. I stayed awake until the first light of dawn, waiting, tense, listening for the return of whatever had attacked. In the morning, I inspected the cabin. One of the boards on the side had splintered. I could see teeth marks and deep scratches gouged into the wood. Whoever or whatever had been outside had tried to get in. I realized then that the presence I had felt wasn't an animal. Animals don't leave scratches like that or lurk with that kind of patience. It was something human, but different somehow, slow, careful, and relentless. The following days were a haze of preparation. I reinforced the cabin as best I could, nailing boards over the weaker walls, clearing lines of sight so I could see any approach from a distance, and rationing food. Max stayed close, never leaving my side. The nights were long and tense, each one bringing new noises. Footsteps circling the cabin, dragging sounds in the weeds, occasional knocks on the wooden walls. Sleep became impossible. I began thinking about how I would escape if it came down to it. Then one morning I saw him, a man, thin and gaunt, standing at the far edge of the field, barely visible against the backdrop of trees. He didn't move, just watched, staring straight at the cabin. My pulse raced. I didn't know how long he had been there. He didn't approach, didn't run. He just observed. I realized he had been behind everything. The noises, the scratching, the way the place felt alive with unseen movement. My only advantage was daylight. I spent the day planning carefully. When night fell, I stayed inside, waiting. Around 1 a.m., I heard the crunching of boots in the weeds again. The man had returned. I didn't fire this time. Instead, I waited. Hours passed. Then, as the moon slid behind clouds, he turned and walked away. I stayed alert until dawn, watching him disappear into the treeline. He never returned. By the next morning, I knew I had to leave. I packed quickly, not daring to make noise. Max and I climbed into the truck, and I started the engine. The vehicle roared to life, and I drove fast down the old dirt road, glancing in the rearview mirror. The man was gone, the fields empty and silent. I didn't look back. I didn't stop until the asphalt of the main road appeared, and the familiarity of distant houses and cars filled me with relief. I never went back to that cabin. Years later, I heard rumors of squatting, of someone living off abandoned farms along that stretch of Pennsylvania. I knew then that the man I had encountered had probably moved on to another empty place, another unwatched house. But I didn't care. I had survived. I had made it out alive with Max at my side. The farm cabin remained a memory, a reminder of how careful and patient some people, or some dangers, can be. Even now, years later, I can remember the wind through the weeds, the creak of the cabin, and Max growling at shadows that only he seemed to see. It wasn't a ghost, it wasn't magic. It was real, human, and that made it far scarier than anything else I had ever faced. It was the summer of 2012 when I first decided to take some time off and rent a cabin in the northern part of Minnesota. I was 32, burned out from the city and the monotony of my office job in Minneapolis. The idea was simple: escape, disconnect, breathe. I found a small, rustic cabin listed on a local website, tucked deep in the forest by a lake called Willow Creek. It wasn't far from the main road, but it was far enough that it promised the solitude I was craving. The cabin came with basic furniture, a wood-burning stove, and even a small dock by the water. The owner assured me the place was private, almost entirely off the grid, but still accessible if needed. I drove there on a Friday afternoon, the sun low and soft in the sky, and the temperature hovering around 70 degrees. My old Jeep creaked as I navigated the gravel road leading to the cabin. The forest was dense, full of pines and birches, and the air smelled like earth and pine needles. When I finally pulled into the small clearing where the cabin sat, I felt the tension of city life begin to slip off my shoulders. The cabin was modest, made of weathered logs with a green tin roof, a small porch with a rocking chair, and windows that reflected the surrounding trees like mirrors. I parked, unloaded my things, and even though I was alone, my dog, Max, a black Labrador mix, was with me. He immediately bounded toward the edge of the woods, sniffing and growling low in his throat, tail wagging but tense. The first night was quiet, almost unnervingly so. I had built a small fire in the wood stove and unpacked some supplies. The lake glimmered under the moonlight, and the crickets and frogs created a rhythm that was both soothing and strange in its intensity. I went to bed early, but sleep didn't come immediately. Every small sound, the creak of the logs, the whisper of wind through the trees, the occasional splash in the lake, felt amplified in the stillness. Max lay at the foot of my bed, alert, ears twitching with every sound. Around midnight, I woke to a sound that didn't belong. It was faint at first, like the crunch of gravel or leaves, but it grew steadily. Someone or something was walking toward the cabin from the woods. My heart jumped, and I froze, straining to hear. The footsteps paused, and then I heard a soft thump against the side of the cabin. Max growled low, his body rigid. I stayed still, trying to reason it out. Maybe a raccoon or deer had collided with the cabin. But then the sound of metal scraping against wood reached my ears. Someone was trying to open the cabin door. I didn't move. My mind raced through scenarios. I didn't have a gun, only a heavy cast iron skillet by the stove. I thought about calling the police, but the cabin had terrible reception. I kept my phone in my hand, Max growling, muscles tensed. The intruder worked methodically, testing the windows and doors. Then suddenly the sound stopped. Silence pressed in so heavily I could hear my own breathing. I waited, tense, until dawn, Max still growling, eyes following every shadow outside. When the first light of morning broke through the trees, I cautiously stepped outside. The ground around the cabin was soft from overnight dew, and I could clearly see footprints. Human footprints, boots, leading to the cabin and circling it. I followed them for a while, but they disappeared into the thick forest. Nothing else was disturbed, nothing stolen, no signs of struggle. I spent the day in a haze, keeping a fire going in the stove, blocking the doors and checking the locks multiple times. Max wouldn't leave my side, constantly sniffing at the edges of the cabin. Over the next couple of days, I became increasingly aware of my vulnerability. The first night had been terrifying, but the second night felt worse. I had barricaded the door with a heavy table and kept a knife nearby. Every small sound set me on edge. Branches breaking underfoot, a distant call of a bird, the wind rustling the trees. They all felt like threats. I started sleeping in short bursts, staying alert, listening. Max became my anchor, his presence reassuring, his instincts sharper than mine. On the third night, I heard it again. Footsteps, lighter this time, moving around the cabin. I stayed still, holding my breath. Whoever it was wasn't violent at the moment, just lingering, observing. I realized I could not wait for something to happen. I needed to take action before being completely trapped. The idea of hiking out was risky. The person might be waiting for me along the path. So I decided to arm myself better. I retrieved an old hunting rifle left by the previous cabin renter, checked it, loaded it, and placed it next to my bed. I also laid out several heavy logs by the door to block it in case of forced entry. By the fourth night, the intruder hadn't returned, and I started thinking I might have been imagining things. Maybe the first night had been some local teenagers messing around. But the next morning, I found a note crudely scratched into the wet soil near the back porch. I know you're here. That day, I did everything I could to prepare. I reinforced the windows with furniture, cleared brush near the cabin to eliminate hiding spots, and made a small signal fire on the porch, something to draw attention if needed. I rationed my food and water, made sure Max had a comfortable place inside, and kept my phone charged as best I could with the weak signal I managed to get near the dock. I refused to leave the cabin during the day, only peeking cautiously from behind the curtains. On the fifth day, I woke before sunrise. Max was growling at the far end of the cabin. I peeked through the curtain and saw movement. A figure crouched near the tree line, watching the cabin. My heart raced, but this time I was ready. I kept calm, slowly picking up the rifle. I made noise, banging the pot I had used for firewood on the metal stove. The figure froze, then bolted back into the woods. I didn't chase, it wasn't worth it, but I watched the spot carefully. By the sixth day, I realized I could not stay indefinitely. The situation was dangerous, and the solitude I had sought had turned into a trap. I decided to hike out carefully in the middle of the day when visibility was best. I packed essential supplies, made sure Max had a sturdy leash, and set out on the trail, rifle slung over my shoulder. I moved cautiously, constantly scanning the treeline. Every snap of a branch or rustle of leaves set me on edge, but the daylight made me feel slightly safer. I finally reached the main road by mid-afternoon. A passing truck stopped when they saw me and Max, and I flagged them down. I explained briefly, enough for them to understand I needed help. They drove me to the nearest town, where I reported the incidents to the police. They couldn't do much. The cabin was on private land, and without evidence of trespassing, there was little they could do. But they took the note and the description of the footprints seriously. I never returned to that cabin. I found a different spot the following year, further north in Wisconsin, where I could have solitude but with more safety. The memory of that week in Minnesota stayed with me for years. I learned to trust my instincts, to prepare for the worst even when seeking peace. And Max, of course, became even more alert, always watching over me. A silent protector whose presence made the difference between terror and survival. That cabin in Minnesota wasn't haunted by ghosts, but it left me with a very real fear, of vulnerability, of being alone in the woods with someone who meant harm. In the end, the lesson was clear. Solitude can be beautiful, but you always need a plan, and you always need to respect the unpredictability of the world around you. I survived because I stayed alert, because I trusted myself, and because I refused to panic. That week changed the way I view isolation and safety, and it's a lesson I carry with me every time I step into the woods. Rifle in hand, Max by my side, ready for anything. I never planned on spending a night alone in a cabin deep inside the Swedish woods, but in late October of 2019, I found myself doing exactly that. I was 32 then, tired from work, and desperate for a few days away from the noise of Malmo. A coworker told me about a cheap old cabin near a lake called Langsjon, far from the main roads and far from people. It sounded perfect. I wanted quiet. I wanted air that felt clean when I breathed it in. And for the first few hours, that was exactly what I got. The cabin sat at the end of a narrow dirt path that was barely wide enough for my small rental car. Fallen leaves covered the road so thickly that the wheels cracked over them with a dry crunch every time I moved forward. When I finally reached the clearing, I saw the cabin, small, dark brown, with old boards that looked worn from years of storms. The roof sagged a little in the middle, and some of the windows were fogged from the inside. There was a smell of damp earth everywhere, mixed with cold pine. Inside, the place was simple. One room with a small bed, a wooden table scratched from years of use, and a tiny kitchen corner with a gas stove that looked older than me. The air was still and cold, and when I dropped my bags, the sound echoed lightly against the wooden walls. I remember thinking it would be a quiet night, maybe too quiet, but I told myself I wanted that. As the sun went down, the temperature dropped fast. The cabin didn't have real heating, just a small iron stove that needed to be fed dry wood. I found a pile of logs next to the wall outside. Some were damp, some were rotting, but I gathered what I could and built a fire. The crackling filled the silence, and the warmth spread slowly through the room. I ate a simple meal, wrote a little in a notebook, then sat on the edge of the bed listening to the wind outside. It must have been around 9 when the noises started. At first, it was just the wind pushing against the old boards, making them creak the way old houses always do. I didn't think much of it, but then I heard something else. Something that didn't fit with the natural sounds of a quiet forest at night. It was a dull, steady thumping, not loud, but sharp enough to cut through the sound of the fire. Came from outside, near the back of the cabin. A slow, repeating thud, like someone stepping on thick branches or hitting wood with something heavy. I froze and listened. The sound stopped, then started again a few seconds later, a little closer, or maybe just clearer. My first thought was that it was an animal, maybe a deer or some large bird moving around. I forced myself to believe that for a few minutes, but the longer it went on, the less it felt like that. There was a rhythm to it, like someone taking slow, heavy steps. I told myself not to panic. I tried breathing slowly, but I couldn't ignore that every muscle in my body was tight. The fire inside the stove popped, and that small, sharp sound made me jerk like something had touched me. The thudding stopped again, but the silence that followed felt wrong. Felt like something was waiting. A little later, I heard a scraping noise near the side of the cabin. A long, dragging sound, like someone pulling something rough along the wall. The wood vibrated under it. I could feel it through the floorboards. I sat completely still on the bed. My hands were cold even though the fire was still burning. I didn't want to go near the window, but I forced myself to move quietly toward it. The glass was cloudy, and the night outside was pitch black except for the faint reflection of the fire behind me. I couldn't see anything. I waited, pressing my fingers against the wooden frame to steady myself. The scraping stopped, and then, directly behind the cabin, I heard soft crunching, like someone walking very slowly on leaves. I stepped away from the window and grabbed the small flashlight I'd brought. My first instinct was to get to the car, but the keys were inside my jacket, which hung near the door. If someone was out there, they'd be close enough to see me open the door, close enough to move toward me faster than I could react. The car was parked about 10 meters from the cabin, far enough that I'd have to be out in the open for a few long seconds. Seconds that suddenly felt like too much. I stayed inside, all lights off except the dying fire. I stood still, listening. The steps circled the cabin once, then twice, each time slower, like whoever or whatever was out there was studying the place. The boards near the back door groaned under weight that sounded human. My chest felt tight with fear. I thought about calling someone, but the cabin had no signal. My phone had one red bar earlier in the day, and now there was nothing. The third time the footsteps circled around, they stopped right outside the front door. I stared at the wooden door, expecting the handle to move or the boards to shake, but nothing happened. Instead, I heard breathing, slow, steady breathing, as if someone was standing inches from the other side. I backed away until my legs hit the bed. I stayed there, knees bent, hands shaking. The breathing continued for almost a minute. Then there was a quiet tap on the door. Not a knock, just a single touch, like a fingertip pressing against the wood. I didn't sleep that night. I sat on the floor near the stove with a piece of broken wood in my hand, pretending it was something I could defend myself with. Outside, the forest went silent, then loud, then silent again. Every small sound felt like a threat, but the footsteps didn't return. When the first light of morning came through the window, I felt like I hadn't taken a breath in hours. I waited until the sun was fully out before I even considered opening the door. When I finally stepped outside, the air was cold enough to sting my skin, but at least I could see everything around me. The ground near the door was covered in footprints. Large, clear footprints of heavy boots circling the cabin over and over again. Some prints were so close to the wall that the person must have leaned against it. Near the back door, the marks in the dirt were deep, like someone had stood there for a long time. And along the entire side of the cabin, there were long scratches, fresh ones, made by something metal dragging slowly across the wood. I didn't even bother packing properly. I threw my bag into the car, started the engine, and backed out so fast that rocks flew from under the tires. I didn't stop until I reached the main road, and even then my hands shook the whole drive back to Malmo. I never went back to that cabin. I told the coworker who recommended it what happened, and he said the place had been empty for months before I rented it. No neighbors, no hikers, no workers in the area. Just a quiet stretch of forest that people rarely visited. For weeks, I kept thinking about those slow footsteps going around the cabin. the breathing outside the door, the scratches on the wall. There were no signs of animals, and there was nothing supernatural about it. It was simply a person, someone moving around in the dark, someone watching me through the windows I couldn't see out of, someone circling the cabin with a tool or weapon in hand, someone who never tried to break in, someone who only watched, someone who wanted me to know they were there. And that was somehow worse. Even now, years later, when I think of that night, I remember one detail more than anything else. That soft tap on the door. Just one small touch. Not trying to enter, not trying to speak. Just letting me know they were standing inches away in the cold darkness, waiting for a reaction I never gave. I still don't know who it was or what they wanted, but I know it was real. And I know I was lucky, very lucky, that when the sun came up, they were gone. Because if they had tapped again, harder, or tried the handle, or waited a little longer, I don't think I would have made it out of that cabin at all. It was the spring of 2012 when I decided to spend a week alone in a cabin deep in the desert outskirts of northern Arizona. I was 26, and I'd been working nonstop in construction all year, scraping and grinding for hours on end, and I needed solitude, something different from the usual city chaos. I found a small, old cabin listed on a rural property website. It was crude, made of weathered wood with a tin roof that rattled when the wind hit right, but it had a charm I couldn't resist. The nearest neighbor was miles away, and the main dirt road that led there was barely maintained. Perfect, I thought, for isolation. The drive out was long, twisting through dry, cracked earth and scrub brush, the sun hitting hard, burning the back of my neck. I didn't see another car for over an hour. When I finally reached the cabin, it looked even more worn than the pictures had shown. The wood was gray, splitting in places, and the porch sagged like it was giving up on holding itself up. But that was fine by me. I unloaded my small pack, some firewood, and my gear for the week. A small generator, a camping stove, water, and enough food for several days. The first night was quiet in a way that felt almost wrong. No distant traffic, no city hum. Just the wind brushing through the junipers and the occasional call of a coyote somewhere far off. I made a fire in the stone pit out front, the flames licking the night air. The stars were blinding. I hadn't seen a sky like that since childhood. I fell asleep on the thin mattress inside the cabin, listening to the wind whistling through gaps in the walls. The next morning, I woke to something strange. My dog, a medium-sized shepherd mix named Boone, was growling low, hackling at the edge of the cabin. I followed his gaze out the window and saw tracks in the dirt. I froze. They weren't human tracks. Not quite. The prints were too long, too narrow, with elongated toes like claws. I brushed it off at first, thinking maybe a coyote or a fox, but something about them didn't sit right. Boone was tense, ears forward, hackles raised. Over the next day, I tried to ignore it, telling myself I was overthinking. I went hiking, exploring a small arroyo nearby, and I noticed more signs. Broken branches, something large moving fast through the brush, disappearing when I tried to focus on it. Boone stayed close, never wandering far, constantly sniffing the air, low growls rumbling in his throat. That night was the worst. Around 2 a.m, I woke to a scraping sound against the side of the cabin. My heart jumped. Boone was standing rigid at the foot of the bed, hackles up, teeth showing slightly. I grabbed my flashlight and shone it around the perimeter. Nothing, but the scratching kept coming, slow, deliberate, almost like fingernails raking wood. My stomach sank. I had no cell service. The nearest road was miles away. I wasn't going to call for help. I realized then that whatever it was, it could be patient. I didn't sleep the rest of the night. Boone stayed close to me, ears twitching, nose wrinkled, growling occasionally. By first light, I decided to investigate cautiously. I opened the door and scanned the area. There were more tracks, bigger now, almost human-sized, but hunched, uneven, dragging in places. My stomach turned. I knew I had to leave, but my truck was too far down the rough road to reach quickly. I spent the day preparing, barricading doors and windows with whatever furniture I could move. Boone stayed close, clearly anxious, refusing to leave my side. That evening, the wind picked up, and with it came movement. Shadows flitted at the edge of the clearing, impossible to identify at first. Then I saw it clearly. A large figure, twisted and low, moving like a man trying to imitate an animal. It was fast, silent, and horrifyingly deliberate. It wasn't human, yet it wasn't entirely animal. The hair was patchy, matted, the limbs long and uneven, and the eyes caught the faint glint of the cabin light. Boone barked, but it didn't scare the thing. It just stopped, crouched, watching us. I stayed frozen for what felt like hours. I thought about firing my hunting rifle, but I hesitated. I wasn't sure what I was dealing with, and I didn't want to provoke it unnecessarily. It didn't move closer, didn't flee, just observed. Then it turned and disappeared into the darkness with the kind of silent grace that no human or known animal possessed. Boone whined but didn't chase. He knew better. I spent the next day packing and planning a safe escape. Every noise, every shadow made my heart jump. The tracks were everywhere, circling the cabin, as if it had been watching me for days, maybe even weeks. I realized then that this thing wasn't just hunting. It was curious, intelligent in a way that made me feel profoundly vulnerable. By dusk, I had everything ready. I set out cautiously, Boone close, sticking to a dry wash that ran roughly parallel to the dirt road. The sun was setting, casting long shadows that seemed to reach for us. I kept glancing back. I saw movement again, just at the edge of my vision, staying behind cover, tracking us silently. Every step was a careful calculation. I didn't run. I knew that would trigger a chase instinct. I moved steadily, methodically, until finally I reached the road and my truck. Once inside the truck, with Boone panting beside me, I locked the doors and started the engine. For a few tense minutes, I thought it might follow, but nothing came out of the brush. I drove slowly at first, then faster as the dirt road opened to a paved one, heart hammering, eyes darting into every shadow along the way. By the time I reached a small town hours later, I felt almost numb. I reported nothing. I didn't know how to describe it without sounding insane. Boone slept the entire drive after that, exhausted but calm, like he knew we'd survived. I never went back. Even now, over a decade later, I think about that week in Arizona. I think about the tracks, the unnatural posture of that thing, the way it moved, and the way it watched me. I don't try to understand it, and I never want to see it again. But I can still hear that scratching sometimes in my memory, that low, deliberate movement just outside the cabin. And I know that somewhere out there, things like it exist, patient, cunning, and entirely real. I still remember the cold bite of that week in early November 1998, when I decided to spend a few days alone in a hunting cabin deep in the northern forests of Minnesota. I was 32, stubborn, and too confident for my own good. I had hunted since I was young, and I thought I knew the woods better than most people. I had taken time off work, loaded my truck with enough food and gear for a week, and driven far away from everything, wanting the quiet that only the deep woods could give. I wanted the kind of silence that feels heavy, like a blanket pressed over your ears. The cabin was old and rough, built decades before I was even born. It stood about 12 miles from the nearest paved road, hidden between tall pines and thick undergrowth. It had one small room with a metal stove, a wooden table, a narrow bed frame, and a shelf nailed crooked in the corner. There was no electricity, no running water, no phone signal. The nearest farm was miles away. That isolation should have made me calm. But from the moment I stepped on the porch and heard how hollow the woods sounded under my boots, something in me felt tight. The air had that sharp smell of cold dirt and wet leaves. I took slow steps inside, set down my pack, and started setting up things the way I liked them. I placed my rifle on the table, stacked firewood near the stove, and shook dust off the old mattress. Every movement echoed in that cramped space. I could hear the forest pressing in from all sides. When the wind blew, the whole cabin groaned like an old man shifting in his sleep. My first night passed quietly, though I woke up 3 or 4 times because of the constant scratching sounds outside the walls. At first I thought it might be raccoons or squirrels digging under the cabin, but the scraping seemed too long and slow. I listened with my eyes open in the dark, trying to stay calm, but the noise would stop every time I moved, almost like whatever it was could hear me shifting. Eventually, I fell asleep out of exhaustion. The second day, I spent walking the nearby trails, checking for deer tracks, trying to get a feel for the land. The forest felt unusually still. The only movement I saw came from a couple of small birds flitting between branches. Even the wind felt cautious. I found a few tracks, but nothing fresh, and some prints looked smeared, as if something had stepped over them. I pushed the thought away and kept going until the evening light faded and the sky turned a deep blue. When I got back to the cabin that night, I felt that same tightness in my chest again. Something about the place felt different, like someone had been there while I was gone. The firewood I stacked that morning looked shifted out of line. A few fresh boot prints were just outside the porch steps, small enough that they definitely weren't mine. They were also angled in a way that made my skin crawl, like someone had stood still in one spot for a long time, just facing the cabin. I scanned the tree line, but everything looked normal. I told myself the prints might be from an old hunting group or a ranger, but the soil had been wet from last night's frost, and the prints looked too clean, too fresh. My breath felt heavy, but I shook it off. I wasn't the type to run home because of something I couldn't explain. That night, the scratching came back, but it was louder, slower, almost thoughtful. It circled the cabin, moved along the back wall, then stopped directly behind the headboard where I was trying to sleep. I lay frozen, breathing as quietly as I could. I felt each sound sink into my spine. I stared at the darkness and counted the seconds between each scrape. When it stopped completely, the silence felt worse, like the whole world was holding its breath with me. By morning, I felt drained, but I forced myself to go out again. Fresh snow had fallen during the night, leaving a thin blanket across the forest floor. Right behind the cabin, straight across the fresh snow, were tracks. Human tracks. One set. They walked from the tree line to the cabin wall, traced along the back, then stopped exactly at the spot where the scratching had paused hours earlier. I stood there staring at them, my breath making clouds in front of my face, feeling a slow, cold fear spread through me. The tracks then turned and went back into the woods, disappearing between the thick pines. Something was wrong, deeply wrong. There was no reason for anyone to be out here, not in the dead cold, not walking around someone else's cabin at night. I kept scanning the trees, half expecting someone to be watching me, but nothing moved. I spent the day inside the cabin, cleaning my rifle, keeping the stove hot. Every small creak made me jump. I tried reading an old hunting magazine I found on the shelf, but my mind couldn't settle. I checked the windows every few minutes, expecting to see a face staring back. By the time the sun dipped behind the trees, the fear had turned into something sharp and painful. I didn't want to stay another night, but the nearest road was too far to reach in the dark, and the snow was falling again. I would have to wait for morning. I barely slept. The scratching returned, louder, faster, hitting the wall like someone dragging a stick along the wood. Then it stopped. Then came the soft crunch of snow, like footsteps. They circled the cabin again. Then silence. Dead, heavy silence. My eyes burned from trying not to blink. At dawn, when the light finally pushed itself through the small window, I packed my things fast. I opened the door to leave and froze. There were tracks everywhere. Not just one set. At least 6 different paths, all human, all around the cabin, overlapping and circling. Some led right up to the window. Some led to the back wall. Some led to the door and stopped only inches away. My stomach twisted. I felt like I had slept through something I shouldn't have survived. I didn't waste time. I threw everything into the truck, started it even though the engine groaned from the cold, and drove faster than I ever had on that narrow trail. Every bump felt like something hitting the truck. I kept checking the rearview mirror, expecting someone to burst out of the trees. When I finally reached the main road, the relief felt like air after being underwater too long. I didn't stop until I reached town, hours later. I booked a room, locked the door, and sat on the bed shaking. I didn't care how it looked. I knew what I saw. I knew I wasn't alone out there. Whoever those people were, they had been watching me for nights. They had come right up to the walls, to the windows, to my bed. And I didn't hear a single voice, not a word, only the sounds of someone moving where they shouldn't have been. The next year, the cabin was torn down by the property owner after a wildfire damaged the area. Sometimes I think about going back to look at the land, but I never do. I don't want to see those trees again. I don't want to feel that silence. And I don't want to know if those same tracks still appear when the snow falls. I tell myself I left at the right time. I tell myself that whatever was out there wasn't meant to cross paths with me again. But the truth settles in the back of my mind whenever I think about that place. I wasn't alone for even a single night, and I didn't realize how close the danger was until the morning I ran. That was the clearest lesson I ever learned out there. Sometimes the scariest things are not the monsters people make up, but the real humans who walk in the dark without saying a word. I had avoided that cabin for years. Even after the divorce, even after everything that happened between me and Claire, I stayed away. It wasn't that I didn't want to see it. It was more like the place had a hold on me I couldn't quite explain. I was 37 now, living a quiet life in a small apartment in Montana, far away from the forests and the snow where the cabin sat. But the moment I got the call that the property had been left to me after my ex-wife passed, something in me couldn't resist. I needed to see it one last time. Not for nostalgia, not for grief, but just to know it was real, that it wasn't a dream I'd been running from for 20 years. The drive took longer than I expected. The old dirt roads were mostly overgrown now, cracked and muddy from the spring thaw. I hadn't been here in a decade. The trees leaned closer to the road than I remembered, thick pines and oaks crowding the path like they were trying to hide the cabin from sight. My hands gripped the steering wheel tighter with every mile, my knuckles turning white. I could feel my heartbeat echoing in my chest, a dull drum of nervous anticipation. When I finally saw the cabin, my stomach sank. It looked smaller than I remembered, or maybe it was just the angle, the overgrowth, the layers of time pressing against it. The paint had peeled in strips, leaving the bare wood gray and rough, and the windows were coated in grime. It sat at the edge of a small clearing, surrounded by dense forest. No smoke rose from the chimney, no signs of life. The door was slightly ajar, swinging slowly back and forth in the wind. I got out of the truck, the gravel crunching beneath my boots. Every sound seemed amplified. The wind through the trees, the faint chirping of birds, the hollow groan of the cabin settling. I hesitated at the threshold, my hand hovering over the door handle. I hadn't been inside since the last time Claire and I were here, before the fights, before everything fell apart. That night ended in anger and screaming, and I hadn't wanted to remember it. Inside, the air was heavy. Dust floated in shafts of sunlight that came through the grimy windows, settling on the floorboards and furniture like a thin layer of ash. The cabin smelled of mildew and wood rot, the faint tang of decayed leaves drifting in from outside. I took a cautious step forward, my boots creaking on the warped floorboards. Everything looked as if it had been left in a hurry. A chair was tipped over in the corner, a blanket crumpled on the sofa, a half-empty bottle of whiskey on the table. I imagined Claire sitting here, staring out the window for hours, maybe waiting for me to come back. I walked slowly through the cabin, touching the walls lightly, running my fingers over the faded wallpaper. In the bedroom, the bed was unmade, the sheets yellowed with age. I could almost see her lying there, restless, tossing and turning, silent tears on her pillow. It was too quiet, and the silence pressed down on me, filling the cabin like water in a bottle. I went into the kitchen. The sink was full of dirty dishes, rusting in the corners. I opened the cabinets. Everything was coated with dust, jars of moldy preserves staring at me like dead eyes. It was then I noticed the door to the back porch. I don't know why I went there, but something drew me. The porch was small, rotting, and the railing was half fallen. I leaned over to look at the woods behind the cabin. The forest was dense, darker than the clearing, shadows clinging to every tree. And then I heard it, a faint, soft crunch of footsteps behind me. My stomach dropped. I spun around, but the porch was empty. No animals, no wind. I told myself it was nothing, probably a deer or a branch falling. I tried to shake it off and went back inside. I decided to check the basement. The stairs groaned under my weight, a low, painful sound that echoed in the walls. The basement smelled worse than the rest of the cabin. Damp, cold, and earthy, like the ground itself had seeped into the stone walls. I flicked on the flashlight I'd brought. The beam cut through the darkness, revealing old tools, broken furniture, and boxes stacked haphazardly. As I stepped further in, my foot hit something hard. I shined the light down and saw a small, rusted tin box. Curious, I picked it up. Inside were letters, old, yellowed, tied with a string. I opened one, the handwriting unmistakable. Claire's. She had written about our fights, about the cabin, about the loneliness. She wrote about how she felt trapped here, how she resented me but couldn't leave. Her words were raw, angry, and full of hurt. But the last letter, it wasn't like the others. It was different. She wrote about someone watching her from the woods, someone who had been there before I arrived that last night we were here. She didn't say who it was, just that she felt eyes on her all the time, that she was never alone. My heart pounded. I left the basement quickly, almost tripping on the stairs. I went back into the main room, trying to convince myself it was just paranoia, just an old house creaking in the wind. But then I heard it again, soft, deliberate footsteps. Not outside, but inside. Slow, careful. I froze, straining my ears. The sound moved from the kitchen to the living room, circling, never stopping. My pulse was racing. I grabbed the flashlight and swept it around, the beam cutting across the floor, the walls, the ceiling. Nothing. I told myself to leave, but my legs felt heavy, rooted to the floor. That's when I saw it. A door I hadn't noticed before, behind the corner of the living room wall. It was small, almost hidden, and it had a latch. My hand shook as I lifted it. Inside was a narrow closet, empty except for a small trapdoor in the floor. The hatch was old, barely hanging on its hinges, but I managed to pull it open. Darkness stared back at me, deep and cold, smelling of earth and decay. I didn't want to go down, but something made me lift the flashlight and climb inside. The stairs were steep and uneven. At the bottom, I found a tiny, earthen cellar, carved directly into the ground. It was empty except for some scattered bones. Animal, I hoped, but I couldn't be sure, and scratches along the walls. Marks made by hands, by claws, by something desperate. The air was thick and foul. I shined the flashlight around, my stomach churning. That's when I realized I wasn't alone. I could feel it. The weight of presence, not a person, but something human had been here, watching, waiting. I scrambled out of the cellar, nearly falling up the stairs. I slammed the hatch shut and bolted to the truck, my heart hammering like a drum in my chest. I didn't stop to look back. The cabin stood silent, the trees swaying gently, the sun breaking through the clouds. I drove away, the forest closing behind me. I never returned. I sold the property months later, unable to face what I had found. Sometimes, when I close my eyes at night, I see the cabin through the trees, dark and quiet, and I remember the weight in the cellar, the letters, the eyes in the woods. I don't know who or what was there, and maybe I don't want to know. Some places aren't meant to be revisited. Some memories are better left buried. I keep a photo of the cabin on my desk now. The truck in the clearing, the peeling paint, the crooked door. It reminds me that some pasts aren't just memories, they're warnings. And even after years have passed, some things don't leave you. It was late October 2007 when I got called out to a rural tip of Montana, somewhere past the main highways and towns. The place was basically a forgotten stretch of pine forest that barely appeared on maps. I had been a cop for about 6 years by then, mostly city patrol work, but I'd recently transferred to a smaller county where calls were fewer and the hours longer. The isolation was part of what I thought I wanted. A slower pace, less chaos. But nothing could have prepared me for that night. I had been working the evening shift alone, which wasn't unusual out there. The deputy I normally partnered with had taken a sick day, so it was just me, my cruiser, and the steady hum of the radio with its occasional crackle of static. Around 8:30 p.m., I got a call about a missing hiker. The dispatcher said the man's wife reported him last seen near a small cabin deep in the woods. She wasn't far from town, but the directions she gave sounded like they were from another era. Old logging roads, barely passable tracks, nothing maintained. The call gave me the impression this wasn't a casual lost hiker case. Something about it felt off. I grabbed my flashlight, my service pistol, and my jacket. My cruiser's engine roared to life, disturbing the quiet of the autumn night, and I drove down the winding two-lane, watching the trees shrink around me. Darkness had settled in heavily by the time I reached the trailhead, so I parked, checked my gear again, and started walking. The cabin was supposedly about 3 miles from the road, which didn't sound too far, but in those woods, every step felt like it stretched endlessly. Pine needles and dry leaves crunched under my boots. The air was sharp with cold, and I could see my breath puff out in short bursts. The forest itself was oppressive. Shadows seemed thicker here, trees twisted unnaturally, their branches tangled high overhead, forming black shapes that made me imagine things moving where nothing could be. My dog, Rex, a big German shepherd, was with me, padded silently alongside, sniffing constantly. He was trained, obedient, but even he was tense, ears pricked, occasionally letting out a low growl. After roughly an hour of walking, the trail ended, or at least what could be considered a trail. It opened into a small clearing, and there it was, a log cabin, almost camouflaged with the forest around it. Its wood was dark and old, with patches of moss creeping up the walls. The windows were grimy and opaque. A thin line of smoke came from the chimney, which was strange. According to the report, no one had been living there recently. I approached carefully. My flashlight beam caught the cabin's details. Splintered wood, nails sticking out, a sagging porch. The front door was ajar. My hand instinctively went to my holster, and I took a steadying breath. Inside, the smell hit first: damp wood, rot, and something metallic that reminded me of iron. There was furniture, mostly broken, scattered, and old blankets piled in a corner. The place had clearly been abandoned for a while, but not entirely. Something or someone had been here recently. I started checking the rooms systematically. The kitchen was small, with a rusted stove and a sink full of grime. I found a chair overturned near the table, and on it, a blood stain, dark and sticky, with small drops leading toward the back door. My pulse quickened, and I motioned for Rex to stay close. The hallway led to 2 bedrooms, both messy but empty, though one had signs of a struggle. A torn sheet on the floor, footprints in the dust, and a broken lamp. Then I heard it, a faint, dragging sound from the far end of the cabin. My first thought was that it was the wind, but it didn't match the rhythm of the trees outside. It was deliberate, slow, cautious, dragging. I signaled Rex to stay low and moved toward the sound. As I rounded the corner, I saw a trail leading down into the basement hatch. The boards creaked under my weight as I descended, my flashlight catching the outlines of crates, old furniture, and jars covered in dust. The basement smelled worse, metallic and damp, sharp enough to make my eyes water. I followed the sound, which stopped abruptly as soon as I reached the bottom. I froze. Silence pressed in, thick and suffocating. Then I noticed movement out of the corner of my eye. Something darted behind a stack of crates, too fast to identify. I raised my gun but didn't fire, couldn't risk hitting someone I might need to save. I heard the faintest whisper of breathing, shallow and irregular. My heart pounded so hard I thought it might echo in the walls. I inched forward, shining the light over every shadow. That's when I saw it. A figure, thin, crouched low against the wall, arms wrapped around itself. The man looked exhausted, dirty, bleeding slightly from a scrape on his forehead. I recognized him immediately, the missing hiker. Relief surged, but it was tempered by the tension still hanging in the air. He couldn't speak at first, just shook his head, pointing upstairs, somewhere in fear. I didn't need him to say more. The basement had another door, one I hadn't noticed before, hidden behind stacked crates. I moved toward it cautiously, gun raised. The latch was rusted but gave way under my pressure. Beyond it was a crawl space that led to the forest outside. I helped the man through, and Rex nudged him forward, protective but gentle. We emerged into the cold night, the moon slanting through the trees, revealing the isolation around us. Once we were clear, I called it in over the radio. Backup arrived within the hour. They swept the cabin while I stayed with the hiker and Rex. What they found confirmed my suspicions. Someone had been hiding there, likely following the hiker. There were traces of someone living off the grid, setting traps, and possibly planning something far worse. Whoever it was had fled once they realized the cabin was no longer secure. The hiker was cold, exhausted, and terrified, but alive. I drove him back toward the nearest town, headlights cutting through the forest. Rex sat alert in the back, growling occasionally, watching the dark tree lines. I kept checking the rearview mirror, half expecting someone to appear, but the road stayed empty. By the time we reached the town's small clinic, the sun was starting to rise. The warm light felt like a reprieve, a tangible promise that the night's danger was over. The hiker was safe, and the authorities would handle the cabin and whoever had been there. I realized, sitting there in the quiet of the car, that fear didn't always come from the unknown. Sometimes it came from the very real presence of someone willing to harm, someone hiding in plain sight, and the helplessness of being alone in the woods. That night stayed with me for years. I never saw who had been at that cabin, and the case eventually went cold, but I kept the memory alive as a reminder of vigilance. Rex, as always, stayed loyal, patient, and protective. The woods themselves hadn't changed. The trees still creaked, shadows still lengthened in the moonlight, but I knew now how fragile safety could be, how quickly calm could turn into danger when no one else was around. I didn't return to that area often, but when I did, I remembered the cold smell of the basement, the blood, the faint dragging sound, and the fear in the hiker's eyes. And I remembered how real courage can be in silence. Moving carefully, thinking clearly, and trusting that a loyal companion might save your life before anyone else arrives. It was the summer of 2018 when I decided to take a break from the city and head out to the mountains. I had been working too much and feeling constantly drained, so I rented a small, isolated cabin in the northern part of Idaho. The cabin was tucked away in a dense forest, a good 2 miles off the main dirt road, and the GPS barely worked once you got past the main path. I went alone, except for Max, my German shepherd, who had been my companion since I rescued him as a puppy. Max was calm but alert, a good mix for a trip like this. The drive was long. By the time I got to the last fork in the road, the sun was already dipping behind the tall pines, painting everything in deep orange and gold. The dirt track leading to the cabin was narrow and winding, lined with overgrown shrubs and broken branches. Every now and then, I had to slow down and push aside fallen twigs to keep the undercarriage of my old Jeep from scraping. Max sat in the passenger seat, his ears perked, occasionally growling softly at shadows that flickered between the trees. The cabin itself was small, made of rough, untreated logs with a metal roof that had patches of rust. It had a tiny porch with a single rocking chair and a creaky old lantern hanging by the door. Inside, it smelled faintly of mildew and wood smoke. The furniture was minimal. A small table, 2 chairs, a stove in the corner, and a bed that looked like it had been hastily thrown together. A fireplace took up most of one wall, with charred logs still in place. It wasn't much, but it was perfect for getting away from the world. I spent the first evening unpacking, stacking firewood, and making sure Max had enough water and space to settle. Outside, the forest was alive with the sounds of insects and distant birds. But as night fell, the sounds changed. There was an unsettling quiet that settled over the trees. The usual chirping faded, replaced by occasional snapping branches and rustling leaves. Max started pacing near the door, his tail low and his body tense. I tried to reassure him, speaking softly, but he wouldn't settle. Around midnight, I woke to a faint scratching sound at the cabin door. At first, I thought it was just a branch brushing against the wood in the wind. But then it came again, slightly louder this time, deliberate. Max's growls grew sharper, almost warning. I grabbed a flashlight and shone it toward the door. Nothing, just shadows stretching across the porch from the moonlight. I forced myself to relax, telling myself it was probably a raccoon or some deer brushing past, but my gut told me otherwise. The next morning, I decided to take a walk in the surrounding woods with Max. The trees were thick, and the ground was uneven, covered with pine needles, fallen branches, and rocks. We walked for hours, and I noted that there were very few signs of human activity. No tire tracks, no distant cabins, nothing. Everything felt isolated, and a subtle unease grew inside me. I noticed odd markings on some of the trees, deep gouges, almost like claws. My first thought was a bear, but the pattern didn't make sense. Still, I didn't panic. I chalked it up to nature, though Max sniffed around the trees intensely, his hackles raised. That night, as I was lighting the stove for dinner, I heard the noise again. This time, it was coming from the side of the cabin. I froze. Max's ears perked, and he darted toward the noise, growling low. I grabbed a heavy flashlight and cautiously moved toward the side window. There, partially hidden in the shadows, I saw movement. Something was there, just out of the corner of my vision. It wasn't a human shape, too fast, too fluid, but it was clearly something large, moving on all fours. I couldn't see details, but it felt wrong. My chest tightened, and I immediately grabbed the rifle I had brought for safety, checking that it was loaded. For the next hour, every sound outside made me jump. The wind blew harder, rattling the metal roof, and branches scraped against the windows. Max refused to leave my side, growling and staring at the dark forest. Couldn't sleep. I stayed up by the fire, flashlight and rifle at hand, listening to every little sound. At some point, I dozed off, Max curled tightly against my legs, his ears twitching at every noise. I woke just before dawn to heavy breathing near the door. Max was barking now, loud and frantic. I swung the flashlight toward the porch and froze. Tracks, large, jagged footprints, led up to the cabin and around the side. They were too big to be a deer and too irregular to be human. They stopped right at the edge of the porch. I swallowed hard. Whoever or whatever had made them hadn't gone back the way they came. I could feel my pulse in my ears, thudding painfully. By mid-morning, I decided I needed to get out. But when I went to start the Jeep, I found something else. The tire tracks leading up to the cabin were gone, replaced by deep gouges in the dirt, like the ground had been clawed apart. It was as if someone or something had been circling, waiting. I realized staying there another night was no longer safe. I packed up quickly, moving as silently as possible, and kept Max close. I didn't look back as I drove down the dirt track, but I kept glancing at the rearview mirror, imagining shadows flitting through the trees. The Jeep struggled over fallen branches and loose gravel, but eventually, I made it back to the main road. Once on pavement, I allowed myself to breathe fully for the first time in 2 days. I didn't stop until I reached a gas station in the next town. I called the rental company and canceled the rest of my stay. Max sat quietly next to me, exhausted but alert, still growling softly every time someone approached the pumps. Even after leaving, I couldn't shake the feeling that something had been watching us in that forest. I researched the area, tried to convince myself it had been an animal, maybe a bear or a mountain lion. But nothing fit the speed, the shape, the footprints. For weeks afterward, I dreamt of the dark forest, of the quiet scratching, of those jagged tracks circling the cabin. Max never forgot either. Whenever we pass dense woods now, he stiffens, growling low, scanning the shadows. In the end, I realized the scariest part wasn't the dark or the isolation. It was how close we had come to something unknown, something that could have ended us if I hadn't stayed alert. And while I returned to the city, to safety and normalcy, I keep thinking about that cabin, about the quiet nights, about Max's unwavering vigilance. Some things in the wild aren't meant to be understood, and some encounters are better left behind. But the memory stays, a constant reminder that not all threats are visible, and not all danger announces itself. I remember the first time I saw the cabin. It was the fall of 1987, late October, and I had decided to take a short trip from my small town of Marion, Indiana, to get away from everything. I was 25 then, freshly out of college, restless, and looking for solitude to sort out the chaos in my head. The place was deep in the woods, more isolated than anything I'd ever experienced. A friend had told me about it, mentioning that it sat near an old, abandoned graveyard just past the northern ridge. I'd always been drawn to quiet, forgotten places, and the idea of a cabin tucked next to a graveyard had a strange, morbid appeal. The drive was longer than I expected. I followed a narrow dirt road, barely wide enough for a single car, winding through dense forest where the trees arched overhead, forming a tunnel of shadows. By the time I reached the clearing, it was late afternoon, and the sun was already low, its light spilling weakly through the branches. The cabin itself looked older than I imagined. It was made of dark, weathered wood, its planks rough and uneven. The roof sagged in places, and the chimney leaned slightly to one side, as if it had been nudged by time itself. Around it, the clearing was overgrown with weeds, and the ground was littered with fallen leaves. What caught my attention first was the graveyard. A few dozen stones, some cracked and worn smooth by the years, were scattered haphazardly. Most had fallen over, leaning at odd angles. Moss crept over the edges, and the inscriptions were hard to read. I noticed a few names: young children, a soldier from the Civil War, an elderly couple. The dates ranged from the late 1800s to the early 1930s. It was eerie, but in a way that felt quiet and solemn rather than frightening. I parked the car and got out, the tires crunching on the dry leaves. The air smelled faintly of damp earth and decaying wood. I explored the cabin slowly, taking in the details. Inside, it smelled of dust, mold, and old smoke. The floorboards creaked under my weight. There was a fireplace, empty and cold, with ashes long since settled. A single table sat in the center of the main room, covered in a thin layer of dust. I found a few old chairs, a rusty lantern, and a wooden chest in the corner, which was locked and heavy. The walls were bare except for a small, faded calendar pinned on a nail, its last page torn away decades ago. The back of the cabin had a small bedroom with a mattress that sagged in the middle. The sheets were gone, but the remnants of old blankets lay crumpled in one corner. I remember running my hand over the rough wood of the walls and thinking how cold and silent it all was, like the cabin had been holding its breath, waiting for someone to disturb it. That night, after I had built a small fire in the fireplace and settled onto the mattress with my dog, Buddy, the real feeling of unease started. Buddy was restless, pacing and sniffing the air constantly. He growled softly at times, ears pricked. At first, I assumed it was because of the unfamiliar surroundings, but soon I noticed the sounds. Not ghosts, not whispers, just sounds that didn't belong. The wind rustled the leaves outside, but occasionally there were thumps and scratches, faint at first, coming from the direction of the graveyard. I told myself it was probably an animal, raccoons or stray dogs, but the sounds were different, heavy, deliberate, something moving among the stones in the dim moonlight. I got up, grabbed a flashlight and stepped outside. The air was cold and sharp. Buddy stayed close to my legs, ears back, tail tucked. I scanned the graveyard, shining the light on each tombstone. Everything looked as I had seen it in daylight. Then I saw a movement, something large, crouched, shifting near the far end of the cemetery. My heart hammered. I focused the beam, but it was gone, melted into the shadows. Sleep was impossible. I stayed awake until dawn, Buddy curled against my chest, both of us listening to the quiet and the occasional crack of wood outside. When morning came, the sun barely lighting the mist that clung to the ground, I thought maybe it had all been my imagination. But as I stepped outside, the ground near the far end of the graveyard was disturbed. Fallen leaves pressed into the soil, footprints leading from the woods into the cemetery and disappearing behind the stones. Human footprints. The next few days were a mix of tension and dread. I explored cautiously, always keeping the flashlight and a hunting knife within reach. I saw signs of disturbance almost every day. Broken twigs along the perimeter, more footprints that didn't belong to me or Buddy, objects moved inside the cabin that I was certain I had left untouched. The strangest was an old bucket I had leaned against the back wall. One morning it was near the fireplace. It was unnerving, but I still told myself I was alone, rationalized everything as the wind, gravity, or my own forgetfulness. Then came the night that I realized I was not imagining it. I had just finished eating, the fire dying down to glowing embers. Buddy was restless again. Around midnight, I heard it, The sound of deliberate footsteps on the cabin's porch. Heavy, slow, deliberate. I froze. Buddy barked once, low and sharp. The footsteps stopped. My hand went to the knife. Silence. Then a faint scratching at the door. I held my breath, counting, trying to tell myself it was a tree branch or some small animal. The scratching grew louder, more insistent, and then suddenly silence again. My instincts screamed at me to run, but I couldn't leave Buddy behind. I grabbed my coat, the flashlight, and the knife, and I opened the door just a crack. Nothing. The cold night air rushed in, carrying the smell of wet leaves and something metallic, like iron or rust. I scanned the yard. No one. The graveyard lay still, bathed in moonlight, stones leaning in quiet testimony. But the sense of being watched didn't leave. I realized then that whoever or whatever had been moving around the cabin had been patient. Watching, waiting. I didn't stay another night. I packed what I could, Buddy whimpering as I hurried him to the car. I drove away as fast as I dared, not daring to glance back. The forest seemed to close around me, the narrow road twisting, the shadows reaching toward the car. Only when I was back on the paved highway, with streetlights appearing ahead, did I finally feel safe. Years later, I learned that the cabin had been owned by an old recluse who had disappeared under mysterious circumstances. People who came to the area occasionally reported strange noises and movement near the graveyard. There were no ghosts, no monsters, no fairy tales. Just someone or several someones who had been using the cabin to hide, observe, and perhaps even practice something dark and secret in the shadows. The sense of fear I had felt was real, grounded in the reality of human intent and unpredictability. Even now, decades later, I can close my eyes and picture that cabin. The leaning stones, the disturbed earth, and Buddy's fur bristling as he growled into the night. I never went back, and I never will. But I learned something important that fall. Fear doesn't need spirits to be real. It can exist in the quiet, in the isolation, in the knowledge that someone or something is watching, moving just out of reach. And sometimes, the world holds spaces we are never meant to enter, no matter how curious or brave we think we are. I never planned to spend that night alone in the woods, and I definitely never planned to build a small cabin in the middle of a storm. But that evening in late autumn of 2016 in northern Alberta forced me into decisions I still think about today. I had gone out there to clear my head after a long week of work and noise, trying to be away from everything for at least one day. I was 31 at the time and thought I knew how to handle the outdoors well enough. So when I parked my truck near the old dirt trail and started hiking deeper into the forest, I didn't feel any fear. The sky was already heavy with dark clouds, but I ignored them, thinking the rain would hold off until I was done exploring. I had taken only a small axe, a folding saw, a backpack with a few tools, and a tarp I always carried just in case. By the time I reached the small clearing I remembered from years ago, the air had already changed. It had that strange electric stillness, the kind that presses on your ears. The wind kept shifting directions as if the forest couldn't decide which way to push the storm. The clearing looked smaller than before, almost swallowed by the tall spruce trees around it, and the ground was soft from earlier drizzle. I felt the first real wave of worry then, not fear but the sense that I needed shelter soon. The rain started suddenly, like someone flipped a switch. Thick drops fell hard enough to sting my skin, and the wind went from a steady push to sharp, twisting gusts that kept throwing wet needles off the branches above. I pulled the hood of my jacket tightly around my head and looked around for anything that could help me get through the night without being soaked. My truck was too far back, and I didn't want to hike in the dark with the trail already swallowed by mud. I made the decision right there to put together a small cabin, or at least something close to it. For walls, a roof, enough to block the rain and keep the cold wind out. I had never built anything bigger than a basic shelter, but the clearing had fallen branches, dead logs, and enough young trees for support beams. I told myself I could manage it. I started by cutting down several straight, thin trees for the frame, sawing through them as fast as I could while the rain grew heavier. The sound of the saw teeth cutting the wet wood echoed sharply, bouncing between the trunks around me. Every few minutes I had to wipe water from my eyes just to see. My hands soon felt stiff from the cold, but I kept working, placing the posts in the soft ground and packing soil around them with my boots until they stood firm. The mud made everything harder. My boots slipped every few steps, and the ground sucked at my feet like it wanted to pull me down. My jacket clung to me, soaked through, and every time I raised my arms to swing the axe, cold water dripped from my sleeves down to my wrists. Still, I kept building. I didn't want to spend a night under a tarp with that kind of wind tearing through the trees. As the frame came together, I noticed how strangely quiet the forest had become. Even with the rain slamming down, I could tell something was off. The usual distant crack of branches, the rustle of animals moving through the underbrush, none of it was there. It was just the rain, the wind, and my own movements. That silence made me work faster, as if part of me felt watched even though I couldn't see anything through the dim, blurry forest. When I went out a short distance to collect thicker branches for the walls, I saw fresh footprints in the mud. They weren't mine. They were longer, narrower, and spaced in a strange way, like someone had been walking with long, uneven strides. They led from the trees toward the clearing, then curved around and disappeared behind a cluster of deadfall. I stopped moving for a moment, the rain hitting the back of my neck like needles, and I felt a long, cold wave run through me. The footprints were new, maybe minutes old. I didn't see anyone around, but the rain distorted everything, making the forest look like it was melting at the edges. The longer I stared into the trees, the more uneasy I felt, so I grabbed what branches I needed and got back to the clearing quickly. I didn't let myself look around too much. I focused on stacking the branches, weaving them between the posts, and packing gaps with wet leaves and dirt. My breath kept coming out in quick, foggy bursts, and the panic sat low in my stomach like a heavy stone. By the time I dragged a fallen log to serve as the base for the roof, the sky had grown even darker. It was only late afternoon, but the storm made it look like the middle of the night. The clearing had turned into a pool of mud, and even the trees around me seemed darker, their wet trunks shining like black stone. I kept hearing faint thumps in the distance, like something stepping on branches, but every time I paused and listened, the sound stopped. Then it would start again once I went back to working. I got the roof up using the tarp stretched over branches laid across the top beams. The small cabin wasn't perfect, but it looked solid enough to shield me through the night. I crawled inside, knees sinking into the mud floor, and felt a strange mix of relief and dread. The space was tight, barely big enough for me to sit upright, but the sound of the rain softened once I was inside. I could breathe better, at least for a moment. Just when I thought I could settle there for the night, I heard it, clear, slow footsteps outside the cabin. Not an animal, not the rain. Something stepping heavily in the mud, just a few feet away from where I sat. The steps moved around the cabin in a half circle, stopping briefly every few seconds. I held my breath, pressing my back against the wall. I felt the wood shift slightly, as if something brushed against it from outside. The rain kept falling, but now I could hear the uneven breathing of something or someone standing near the entrance. I stayed completely still. My heart thumped so hard I felt it in my throat. The steps continued again, slower this time, circling the structure. I remembered the footprints I had seen earlier, the long, uneven stride, and a deep fear settled into me. Whoever it was had been tracking me long before I started building the cabin. Minutes passed like hours. Eventually, the steps drifted away, fading into the rain. I didn't move for a long time after that. I kept listening for any sign of whoever was out there. I didn't dare sleep. The cold kept creeping through the walls, and the rain dripped steadily through small gaps in the roof. But I stayed awake, knees pulled to my chest, waiting for the sky to lighten. When dawn finally came, the rain had stopped. Weak light filtered through the trees, gray and thin. I crawled out slowly, scanning the clearing. The mud was full of footprints, those same long, narrow marks circling the cabin over and over through the night. They trailed off into the trees but never came back. I didn't wait around to study them. I packed my things, tore down the tarp, and left the cabin standing there. I moved fast through the wet forest, not stopping once until I reached my truck. My clothes were stiff from the cold. My muscles ached from building all night, but I felt a deep relief the moment I shut the truck door behind me. I never went back to that clearing again. I don't think about the cabin itself as much as I think about the footprints and the feeling of being watched in that storm. Whatever walked around the cabin that night wasn't an animal, and it wasn't lost. Knew I was there. The cabin is probably still standing somewhere deep in those woods, but I have no interest in seeing it. Whenever I think about it, I remember the silence, the heavy breathing outside the thin wall, and the way the footsteps circled me in the dark. That night taught me something I never forgot. Being alone in the woods doesn't mean you're the only one out there.